Hi there, my name's Ben and I like to read. Today we're going to be reviewing a book by Ari Shavit called My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Now I want to preface this by saying this is not a political channel. We are not going to discuss the Israel-Palestine debate. We're going to strictly review the book. We're going to try to be as objective as possible in this. Of course, as someone who is not involved and has no skin in that game, we are going to do our best to focus solely on the book and what Mr. Shavit has to say. That said, of course, this is a controversial topic to begin with, and sometimes you have to court controversy in order to fully express an idea. So we'll go along with it and we'll see how it goes. Now, Ari Shavit is he's an Israeli writer. Of course, like many Israelis, he served in the Israeli Defense Forces as part of his mandatory conscription, and throughout his career, eventually leading up to him writing this book, he started to think about what his country meant to him, which is what spurred him to not only look at his own family history, and it turns out that some of his he's descended from a Jewish family from the United Kingdom, but also how this impacts his modern day country, the country that he was born in and that he grew up in. So this has been described by Thomas L. Friedman, who is an expert of geopolitics, particularly in the Middle East, as a must-read book. And I do tend to agree with him, because this is nonfiction. This follows two journeys. This follows Ari Shavit's ancestors' journey into Palestine, where they had actually taken a trip in the late 19th, early 20th century, and this also Ari Shavit takes that same trip as well, but it also gets into the history of Palestine and of Israel, where the Turks were there, when the British were there, and then of course since 1948. So as a nonfiction book, again, there's no real plot to it. It's more so the journey that and the history that Shavit discovers. I would say I really enjoyed this book, mainly because, again, it provided a voice that I hadn't necessarily heard before. By voice, of course, I mean perspective. And we could say that, okay, well, we don't hear enough Palestinian voices as well. I think that, I would tend to agree. I would love to see. I would love to read a book in a similar way that of a similar topic, I should say, from a Palestinian perspective. It's because, again, it is such a complex issue that, I would be doing it injustice by even attempting to speak about it. However, how can you speak about this book if you don't speak about the conflict between the two opposing forces? That's not necessarily what Shavit focuses on in this book. If anything, he focuses on the fact that again, within Israeli society there are more divisions than we previously think. We tend to think of them as a fairly monolithic and united society when they're really not. There are a couple of sequences in the book where he's describing the Jewish populations from Arab nations, so from North Africa, from Iran, or they're not an Arab nation, they're Persian, but from Iraq, from Syria, and from Yemen, and they all come in the 50s after, of course, the Ashkenazi Jewish population of Europe, the the survivors of the Holocaust. They came and they already made Aliyah to Israel, and it's interesting to see how unprepared the Israeli state was for this sort of eventuality. And it's interesting, of course, to hear the story because, of course, not many, at least in popular discourse, it's not really discussed the fact that these Jewish families who were living in North Africa and in Iraq and in Syria and some parts of Central Asia and in Yemen, they were living there for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. If anything, they didn't really feel an extremely strong connection to the new state of Israel, and all of a sudden now they're essentially left with no choice but to go there. And the government at the time, of course, was not ready for this influx of new Jews, and so again, those effects are still felt in Israeli society. So it's an interesting internal perspective that you don't really get a whole lot of. And then of course he goes into the Iron Dome, the Iron Dome system, the anti-aircraft and anti-rocket system that Israel has, and essentially he goes in and he states that we're privileged to have it because it essentially it has created a very hermetically sealed environment for Israeli society to develop, but of course at what cost? And he raises some very good questions in the book. I mean, there are some, I guess, who could consider this to be a shooting and crying book. And what shooting and crying is essentially, a very hardline nationalist perspective of, you participated in the military and did all of these things and you feel guilty about it. But I don't think that that's the case. I think that what Shavit is trying to do in this book is he's trying to give as objective as a personal journey can be, and sort of delve into how the society of Israel was created and how imperfect it is, despite what other people may think. And I think it is really important and I think that if anybody is interested in that part of the world and is interested in that, conflict, that geopolitical conflict, I think they should read this book just because, again, it provides a perspective, like I said, that was fresh, that I had never heard of before. I had a preconception. It's almost like, the stereotype that, all people from the United States are morbidly obese and stuff like that. You think that, everyone who lives in Israel is, they're all, descended from this one spot. They all relatively come from Europe, but it's not the case. Like they come from all over the world, and they bring different their different cultural aspects, and they bring their different ideas, and they don't always mesh together to form the quote unquote homogenous state that we perceive Israel to be. So that's why I thought it was very, very interesting, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody else who's interested in the topic of Israel and the topic of Israel versus Palestine. I would love to get a Palestinian perspective as well, because I think that, again, that would be almost the perfect companion piece to it. And if you know of any, please let me know. I would be more than happy to read them. That said, my final thoughts, I think it's a great book. If you've read it before, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. If you haven't, like I said before, highly recommend it. Don't skip out on it. Pick it up, read it, and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.